March 14th, 1984. Robert Henshaw was 39 years old, standing in the parts department of Timber Creek, New Holland, 7 miles outside Canton, New York. He had driven there alone. His wife, Carol, had asked him not to go. The dealership smelled like hydraulic fluid and new rubber. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Behind the counter, a sales manager named Dennis Walcott slid a single sheet of paper across the laminate surface, a final financing offer on a New Holland 8340 tractor, 130 horsepower, with a front-end loader package and a 5-year note at 13.8% interest. Robert had been farming dairy for 16 years. He ran 73 Holsteins on 180 acres, half of it rented. His current tractor was a 1971 model he'd bought used in 1978. It burned oil. The clutch slipped in wet conditions. Twice in the last year, it had left him dead in the field during silage season, and both times he'd lost half a day waiting for a mechanic to drive out from town. He needed something reliable. Dennis Walcott knew that. The deal on the table was this: $52,000 financed over 60 months, with payments starting in 90 days. Trade-in value on the old tractor would cover the down payment. Robert would walk out with a machine that wouldn't break, wouldn't burn oil, wouldn't leave him stranded. Carol had wanted to wait. 2 more years, she'd said. Let the old tractor die completely. Buy something used in 1986 when prices dropped and interest rates cooled. She'd done the math. She'd shown him the numbers on a legal pad at the kitchen table 3 nights earlier, her handwriting small and deliberate. Robert had nodded, but he hadn't agreed, because Carol's plan assumed nothing would go wrong in the next 2 years. It assumed the old tractor would hold. It assumed no breakdowns during first cut, no missed hauls, no compounding delays that would cost them more than a payment ever would. Robert didn't believe in that kind of luck. He believed in what he could control. So on March 14th, 1984, he signed the paper. Dennis Walcott shook his hand. Robert drove home in the old tractor, and the New Holland 8340 was delivered 4 days later on a flatbed, bright blue and factory clean, still smelling like paint. Carol saw it from the kitchen window. She didn't come outside. Early context. Robert Henshaw had grown up 15 miles south, in a town called Lisbon, on a beef farm his father sold in 1971. He'd learned early that machinery wasn't romantic, it was arithmetic. A tractor was a tool that either paid for itself or buried you. His father had taught him to fix everything twice before calling a mechanic. Robert could rebuild a carburetor in a barn with a trouble light and a set of sockets he'd owned since he was 19. He wasn't afraid of maintenance, but he was afraid of unpredictability. The old tractor had become unpredictable. Carol had grown up in town. Her father sold insurance. She understood budgets, monthly obligations, and the danger of overreach. She had worked as a part-time bookkeeper for a feed supplier before they married, and after their son Ben was born in 1978, she kept the farm's records in a green ledger she stored in the drawer beneath the telephone. She knew what they owed. She knew what milk prices were doing. In early 1984, milk prices were dropping. The federal support system was shifting. Dairy farmers across New York were starting to hear rumors about herd buyouts, about consolidation, about operations that wouldn't survive the next 5 years. Carol had heard those rumors. Robert had heard them too. But Robert believed that survival came from reliability. If you didn't break down, you didn't lose time. If you didn't lose time, you didn't lose money. The math was simple. Carol believed survival came from margin. If you didn't overextend, you had room to adjust when prices fell. Her math was simple too. They were both right. They were both wrong. The New Holland 8340 arrived on a cold morning in late March. Robert spent the first hour in the cab, reading the manual, adjusting the seat, running through the loader controls. The machine was heavier than anything he'd ever operated. The engine was quiet, the hydraulics were smooth. He used it that same afternoon to scrape the barn lot. It didn't struggle. For the first time in years, Robert felt like he was ahead of something instead of behind it. Carol watched from the porch. She didn't say anything, but Robert saw her face, and he knew. First turning point. The payment structure was simple. 90 days deferred, then $1,149 per month for 60 months. The first payment came due in mid-June 1984. By then, milk prices had dropped another 6 cents per hundredweight. Robert's check that month from the co-op was $4,707. After feed, fuel, and the mortgage on the rented acreage, he had $1,890 left. The tractor payment took more than half of that. Carol brought it up once. They were sitting at the kitchen table after supper. Ben was in the living room watching television. She slid the ledger across to Robert and pointed to the column on the right. "We're $700 short this month," she said. Robert nodded. "I know. Where's it coming from?" "I'll cover it." "How?" Robert looked at her. "I'll cover it, Carol." She closed the ledger. She didn't ask again. Robert sold a cull cow 2 weeks later and made up the difference. The next month, he pushed a refrigerator repair into the following year. The month after that, he delayed a vet bill. He kept current on the tractor. The New Holland 8340 performed exactly as Dennis Walcott had promised. It didn't miss a day. It hauled silage in August without overheating. It pulled the manure spreader through February mud without bogging. When Robert needed to move round bales or load a truck or grade the lane after a storm, the machine did it the first time, every time. It saved him hours. It saved him service calls. It saved him the anxiety of wondering whether he'd be dead in the field when the work mattered most. But it didn't save him money. Because by late 1985, the farm crisis that Carol had worried about was no longer a rumor. It was happening. Milk prices fell below $12 per hundredweight. Input costs rose. Fuel climbed. Feed climbed. The rented land Robert worked came up for renewal, and the landlord raised the rate by 18%. Robert took it. He didn't have a choice. He needed the acres. Other farmers were starting to fold. A neighbor 2 miles west sold his herd in October 1985 and took a job at the school district. Another family Robert knew from church listed their farm in the spring of 1986 and moved to Pennsylvania. Robert kept working. Carol kept the books. The tractor payment never missed, but the margin disappeared. Long middle arc. By 1987, Robert and Carol barely spoke about money. She paid the bills. He worked the farm. When the ledger didn't balance, she found a way to stretch it. She delayed her own dental work. She bought clothes for Ben at a second-hand shop in Potsdam. She stopped replacing kitchen items that broke. Robert noticed. He didn't say anything, because he knew what she would say. The tractor still ran. In the summer of 1988, Robert used the New Holland 8340 to pull a neighbor's broken hay baler out of a ditch. The neighbor offered him $50. Robert took it and put it toward that month's payment. In the winter of 1989, he plowed driveways for 3 families in town, charging $25 per job. It wasn't much, but it helped. The tractor became more than a tool. It became a source. Robert started looking for custom work, baling, hauling, grading. He'd leave the farm at dawn, spend 6 hours on someone else's land, and come home to milk. Carol managed the barn while he was gone. She never complained. But Robert could feel the distance growing. It wasn't loud. It wasn't sudden. It was the accumulation of 1,000 small silences. Carol stopped asking about the payment. She stopped asking about the plan. She stopped asking about anything related to the farm. In the fall of 1989, their son Ben turned 11. He was old enough to help, and Robert started bringing him into the barn after school. Ben liked the work, he liked the routine, he liked the tractor. Robert taught him how to run the loader, how to adjust the hitch, how to check the oil. Carol watched from the kitchen window, the same place she'd been standing the day the New Holland arrived. She didn't come outside. By 1990, the farm was surviving, but it wasn't growing. Robert's herd stayed at 73 head. His rented acres stayed the same. Milk prices had stabilized slightly, but margins were still tight. Other farmers who had weathered the crisis were beginning to expand, adding cows, buying land, investing in new parlor systems. Robert couldn't. Every dollar he made went into keeping current. The tractor payment was now in its 7th year. Carol had stopped updating the ledger in front of him. She kept it in the drawer, but she didn't bring it to the table anymore. Robert knew what that meant. In the spring of 1991, Carol asked him a question. They were standing in the barn. Ben was at school. The radio was on, playing low. "Do you think it was worth it?" she said. Robert looked at her. "The tractor?" "All of it." Robert didn't answer right away. He looked out at the lot, where the New Holland 8340 was parked near the fence, 7 years old, still clean, still running like the day it arrived. "It kept us going," he said. Carol nodded. "Yeah," she said. Then she walked back to the house. 2 months later, she told him she wanted a separation. The separation, Carol moved into a rental in Canton in July 1991. She didn't take much. Ben stayed with Robert during the school year and spent weekends with her. The arrangement was quiet, civil, and sad in the way that most endings are when no one raises their voice. Robert didn't fight it. He'd known it was coming. Maybe not consciously, but in the way you know a machine is failing before it actually stops. A vibration, a noise, a hesitation that tells you the end is closer than the beginning. Carol had stayed as long as she could. The farm had asked for more than she had. Robert kept working. The tractor payment ended in August 1991, 3 months after Carol left. 60 months. $68,940 total, including interest. The New Holland 8340 was now fully paid. Robert owned it outright. He felt nothing. Middle years, 1992 to 1999. The farm didn't collapse after Carol left. It didn't thrive either. Robert kept 73 cows. He kept the rented land. He kept Ben involved, and by the time Ben was 16, he was running morning milking on his own. The New Holland A340 ran every day, 10 years old, 12 years old, 15 years old. Robert replaced the clutch once, the starter twice, and the hydraulic lines in the loader after a freeze crack in the winter of 1996. Otherwise, the machine never quit. He used it for everything: baling, hauling, spreading, scraping, plowing snow, pulling stumps, moving feeders, grading the lane. Other farmers in the area started to notice. "That the same 8340 you bought in '84, they'd ask. Robert would nod. "Still running?" "Every day." They'd shake their heads, half impressed, half skeptical. By the late 1990s, most of Robert's peers had upgraded. Tractors from the mid-'80s were being traded in for newer models with cabs, air conditioning, better fuel efficiency, GPS guidance systems. Robert didn't upgrade. He didn't need to. The New Holland 8340 still worked. And Robert had learned something in the years after Carol left. The machine had never been the problem. The debt had been the problem. The timing had been the problem. The fact that he'd been right about reliability and wrong about everything else, that had been the problem. But the tractor itself? The tractor had done exactly what it was supposed to do. In 1998, Robert attended an equipment auction in Gouverneur. A neighbor he'd known for 20 years was selling out. Herd, machinery, land, everything. The neighbor had bought new equipment in 1985, just like Robert, but he'd bought more of it. And when milk prices dropped, he couldn't cover the payments. Robert watched the auctioneer sell off a whole line of iron: tractors, balers, a combine, a feed mixer, good equipment, well-maintained, all of it gone in 4 hours. Robert went home that night and walked out to the barn. The New Holland 8340 was parked in its usual spot, covered in dust, engine cool. He stood there for a long time. Then he went inside. Ben's decision. In the fall of 2003, Ben Henshaw graduated from SUNY Cobleskill with a degree in agricultural business. He was 25. He'd grown up on the farm, worked every summer, knew the herd, knew the land, knew the rhythm of the work. Robert assumed he'd come back. Ben did. But not the way Robert expected. Ben came home with a plan. He wanted to expand the dairy, add 30 cows, lease another 60 acres, build a new freestall barn, apply for an FSA loan, and modernize the parlor. He had spreadsheets. He had projections. He had a 5-year growth model. Robert listened. Then he said no. "We don't have the margin," Robert said. "We will if we scale," Ben said. "And if we don't, then we're no worse off than we are now." Robert shook his head. "That's not true." Ben didn't argue. He'd grown up watching his father make one decision over and over: survival over growth, reliability over risk, control over leverage. Ben understood it, but he didn't agree with it. 2 years later, in 2005, Ben left. He took a job managing a 400-cow operation in Vermont. Robert didn't try to stop him. He milked alone for the next 3 years. The New Holland 8340 turned 21 years old. It still ran. Late revelation, 2008 to 2014. In the spring of 2008, Robert sold 40 of his cows. He was 63. His back hurt. His knees hurt. The work had gotten harder, and the prices hadn't gotten better. He kept 33 head and hired a part-time milker from town. The farm shrank, but it survived. Ben called once a month. He'd gotten married, he had a daughter. He was doing well in Vermont. The operation he managed had grown to 600 cows, and he'd been promoted to herd manager. Robert was proud. He didn't say it often, but he was. In 2011, Carol remarried. Robert heard about it through a mutual friend. He was happy for her. He didn't reach out. By 2013, Robert was 68, and he started thinking about what came next. He couldn't milk forever. The herd was down to 27 head. The rented land had been sold to a developer 2 years earlier, and Robert had consolidated onto the 120 acres he owned outright. It was enough, but it wasn't a career. It was a ending. In the summer of 2014, Ben called. "I'm thinking about coming back," he said. Robert didn't say anything. "The operation here is selling," Ben continued. "New owners want to bring in their own people. I've got 6 months." "What are you thinking?" Robert asked. "I'm thinking I could run the home farm, build it back up, start small, see what's possible." Robert looked out the kitchen window. The New Holland 8340 was parked in the same spot it had been parked for 30 years. 30 years. The machine was older than Ben's daughter. "You'd have to replace equipment," Robert said. "I know." "The tractor's 30 years old." "I know." There was a pause. "Does it still run?" Ben asked. Robert almost smiled. "Every day." Return and reflection. Ben Henshaw moved back to Canton in October 2014. He brought his wife, his daughter, and a 15-year business plan that Robert read once and didn't comment on. Robert sold Ben the herd, the land, and the equipment for a price they agreed on over a handshake. The New Holland 8340 was part of the deal. Ben kept it, not because it was the best tractor available, not because it was the most efficient, but because it was still running, and because it meant something. Robert moved into a small house in town, 10 minutes from the farm. He drove out twice a week to help with evening milking, but he didn't interfere. Ben expanded the herd to 50 head in the first year, 70 in the second. By 2016, he'd leased back some of the land Robert had lost and built a modest freestall addition onto the barn. It wasn't rapid growth, but it was steady, and it was his. The New Holland 8340 stayed in service. Ben used it the same way Robert had, scraping, hauling, loading, pulling. He replaced the injectors in 2015. He rebuilt the transmission in 2017. The machine turned 35 years old in 2019. It still ran. Final years. In the fall of 2020, Robert Henshaw turned 75. He was in good health, but he'd slowed down. He still visited the farm, but mostly he sat in the barn office, drank coffee, and talked to Ben about milk prices, weather, and the things that didn't change. One afternoon in late September, Ben was getting ready to scrape the lot. He climbed into the New Holland 8340, turned the key, and the engine fired on the first crank. Robert was standing near the barn door. Ben looked over at him. 36 years, Ben said. Robert nodded. 36 years. Ben put the tractor in gear and drove out into the lot. Robert watched him go. He thought about Carol. He thought about the payment structure, the ledger, the kitchen table. He thought about the day he signed the paper at Timber Creek, New Holland, and the way Dennis Walcott had shaken his hand like they'd both done something smart. He thought about the neighbor who'd sold out in 1998. He thought about the farms that didn't make it, and he thought about the ones that did. The tractor had outlived his marriage. It had outlived the crisis. It had outlived the plan. Robert had been right about the machine. He'd been wrong about the cost. Not the financial cost. He'd paid that off in 1991. The other cost, the one that didn't show up in a ledger, the cost of being right when it didn't matter, the cost of reliability when what you needed was flexibility, the cost of surviving when survival meant you stopped living in any other direction. Carol had wanted to wait. She'd wanted margin. She'd wanted room to breathe. And Robert had wanted control. He'd gotten it. The New Holland 8340 had given him exactly what he'd paid for. It had kept him going. It had kept the farm alive. It had never let him down. But it hadn't saved him from the thing he couldn't see coming. It hadn't saved him from himself. Ending. In the spring of 2024, Ben Henshaw ran 112 head of cattle on 340 acres. The farm was profitable, Not wealthy, but stable. His daughter was 16. She helped in the barn after school. The New Holland 8340 was still in service, 40 years old. Ben had been offered trade-in deals a dozen times. Dealers wanted it gone. Salesmen called it a liability, but Ben kept it. He kept it because it ran. He kept it because his father had bought it the year Ben was 6, and because he could still remember watching Robert adjust the loader controls for the first time, his hands careful, his face focused. He kept it because the machine had cost his father something Ben would never fully understand. And he kept it because some things aren't measured in depreciation schedules or resale value. Some things are measured in years, in what they outlast, in what they witness. Robert Henshaw died quietly in his sleep in February 2024, 3 weeks before his 79th birthday. Ben found the old financing papers in a box in Robert's house, the original contract from Timber Creek, New Holland, dated March 14, 1984, signed in his father's handwriting. 5-year note, 13.8%, paid in full, August 1991. Ben folded the paper and put it back in the box. Then he went home. The New Holland 8340 was parked in the barn, engine cool, paint faded, still smelling faintly of hydraulic fluid after 40 years. Ben stood there for a long time. Then he walked back to the house, where his wife and daughter were waiting. The tractor would still be there in the morning. It always was.